Hi folks, and welcome to Philosophy According to Eddie. And this week we'll be looking at the ethical philosophy of utilitarianism. Now, utilitarianism has been very influential. It's one of the key normative ethical theories that we look at. And it can be summed up really in the phrase, the greatest good to the greatest number. It is a theory that came from the Enlightenment period. So same sort of period as Immanuel Kant with Kantian ethics. This was a period of search for fixed laws, and while Kant went for the idea of fixed laws based on duty, deontological approach, check out the previous video if you haven't seen that already, the utilitarians looked for other fixed laws. The problem with a lot of the previous ideas around ethics was that rules could clash, and utilitarianism was an approach to find a rule that didn't clash. Jeremy Bentham, came up with act-utilitarianism in this Enlightenment period, but his student, John Stuart Mill, developed the idea of utilitarianism into rule-utilitarianism. And then later on in the 20th century, Peter Singer came along and introduced preference-utilitarianism. But all of them are based on the same idea of trying to get the greatest good to the greatest number. So we'll have a look at these three forms of utilitarianism and also look at some of the criticisms, including those from Sir Bernard Williams and potentially from Aristotle himself. Jeremy Bentham's idea of utilitarianism is otherwise known as act-utilitarianism. Well, strictly speaking, it's a form of act-utilitarianism. There are other forms, but his is considered to be the main version of it. Bentham came up with the idea of the hedonic calculus, i.e. working out how to get the greatest pleasure, as in hedonism. And the hedonic calculus, in generating pleasure, meant that you could work out what was the greatest good, because for Bentham, good and pleasure are exactly the same thing. Now that's something we might want to query. Is good and pleasure exactly the same? Can we not think of bad pleasure? Because if you can think of bad pleasure, then pleasure and good can't be exactly the same. Otherwise you'd essentially be saying that you can have bad good. But anyway, this idea of good is very much linked to pleasure. And so when Bentham talks about seeking always the greatest balance of good over evil, he's really saying look for the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people over the amount of pain that you're going to end up causing, or basically limit the amount of pain you're creating. So this is very, very teleological. It's based entirely on consequences. Lots of good, as little evil as possible, or as much pleasure as possible, and as little pain. Now, Bentham even went further and came up within his hedonic calculus with 7 aspects as to how to calculate pleasure or good. And we're going to call it good, but when we're talking about Bentham, just remember it's pleasure. Intensity, so how strongly felt it is. Duration, how long it lasts. Certainty, how certain is it going to cause pleasure. Propinquity, which is how soon will it create it. Fecundity, which is how likely is it going to create good. Purity, so how much good there is compared to the amount of bad that's going to be created. And also extent, how many people are going to be affected. So with all these, it's almost like sliders. So you set the slider based on what sort of act you're doing, and that will give you an overall level of how much good you're going to create. And if you get a greater balance of good over evil, job done. It does lead to a few problems, particularly this idea of pleasure being the same as good, and that's why G.E. Moore actually changed some of his ideas and came up with a different form of act utilitarianism that was about the ideally good. So seek always the greatest balance of ideally good over evil. So we're talking about the best form of good, the highest forms of good. But Bentham stuck with his idea of pleasure. He thought this is simple, it's effective, it's a fixed rule. And this was really the founding basis of utilitarianism. Seek always the greatest balance of good over evil. One of the big problems with seeking the greatest balance of good over evil is that that then implies that the greatest good should be done to the greatest number of people. But this creates a problem. Utilitarianism is based on the principle of good. But by suggesting it's the greatest good to the greatest number, you're really introducing justice into this. And justice is not an intrinsic part of goodness. Some argue that it is. Situation ethics, for example, the suggestion is that love distributed is justice and love is good. But in utilitarianism, that's never mentioned. The justice issue is left kind of hanging. But we do have to think about justice if we think about the greatest good to the greatest number when we're thinking about the act utilitarian. Because the act utilitarian, so-called because it's based on doing the correct act in the correct situation. There are no rules, there are no set principles beyond do the greatest amount of good. So each situation is relative. And that means you've got to try to do the greatest good to the greatest number, but that might come up with some strangely counterintuitive results. You may, for example, find yourself privileging some people over others. If you wanted to distribute the greatest good to the greatest number, in theory, you could distribute £1 to 100 people, or you could give one person £100. The utilitarian difference is pretty much nothing. There's £100 worth of good which is going to be distributed. It just happens to go in different ways, and there's no suggestion that it should go one way or the other. But that means you could privilege one person instead of sharing out to everyone. Of course, you can, when you start looking at other ideas of sort of income distribution within a society, you can come up with ideas that if everyone has got a certain amount, then it creates more overall good, but that's really social theory, not philosophy. The other problem here is that act utilitarianism, always acting to create the greatest good, has no room for people to have natural rights, like a right to life. It's entirely based upon the situation, it's entirely teleological. So, you could theoretically kill one person to harvest their organs to save 10 people's lives, and that would be perfectly utilitarian. But that creates a massive moral issue. Is that really right? I mean, Jeremy Bentham thought the idea of natural rights was nonsense on stilts. He just did not believe in natural rights at all. And John Stuart Mill, who did oppose some of Bentham's ideas, did nonetheless suggest that the most important thing is that people are free, and that freedom is very, very important, and the only time that we should stop people from being free, i.e. intervene, is when they're about to cause harm to others. But this means that people should be free to neglect themselves, poison themselves with drink and drugs, and we shouldn't worry about that. People should be free to even kill themselves. And that doesn't affect natural rights because, well, there aren't really any. And this creates a big ethical question. Is it really a true ethical theory if it denies people their natural rights? One of the major issues with act utilitarianism is that it's often difficult to calculate where the greatest good is going to come from when you're put into a situation. It can take a lot of thought, and for example, if it's a pressing situation, like someone's putting their life at risk, you may not have time to think it through. you might be better off having a hard and fast rule, like Kant would suggest, where you can think of it quickly and you can act. This is where John Stuart Mill, Bentham's pupil, came in with rule utilitarianism. Rather than trying to work things out case by case, you follow certain rules that will generally lead to the greatest good over evil. So you create these general rules from your experience and using your judgment, and that allows you to exercise utility. So this has now become a bit more deontological. It's taking on a similar approach almost to Aquinas' natural law, where you've got an absolute set of principles that are applied situationally. And John Stuart Mill came up with the idea of liberty, which is a perfect example of a rule utilitarian rule. People should have absolute freedom as long as they are not causing harm to others. So do what you like as long as you're not causing harm to others. That's a rule. And it creates the greatest good opposed to evil, according to John Stuart Mill. And he does go into quite a bit of depth in this On Liberty, the book that he wrote, which covers the principle of liberty and the harm principle, as it's known. This is the harm principle. He's reluctant to suggest that we should intervene when people are harming themselves, but he does sort of suggest that actually, if people are harming themselves, they will harm others because they'll harm society, they'll harm their families, and so there are times when one should intervene. He was writing in a time where for children and for other races this was not considered to be applicable. We must bear that in mind, but we must also bear in mind that this is coming from a particular time period. So you make your judgment on that one. A problem with this is that this can lead to instrumentalism. Instrumentalism is where you end up maintaining the rules and using people as an instrument to achieve that rule. So the rule becomes more important than the individual. And if we're talking about an ethical theory, this should really be about the individual, surely. So you might end up allowing people to be harmed in order to maintain the rule, rather than doing what is right for them. And the other problem is that by introducing rules, you're actually coming up with the possibility of rules clashing with each other. Circumstances where there's rule clash, which was the whole point of utilitarianism in the first place, to make sure there wasn't any rule clash. So, rule utilitarianism helps to get rid of some of the issues around act utilitarianism's case-by-case basis, and some of the illogical results that came from it. I mean, even Jeremy Bentham rejected act utilitarianism in the end. So it helps get rid of all that, but it does create some more problems. So having looked at act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism, Peter Singer came up with the idea of preference utilitarianism to try to get around the problems of both. He suggested we need to look at this issue of good itself. Let's replace the idea of pleasure, the greatest pleasure to the greatest number, with the idea of rational preference. So the greatest amount of what we rationally prefer against the amount of pain that's caused. And this is good because it allows people to be altruistic. They can sacrifice themselves, they can make rational choices about what's needed. Also, it shifts the focus onto really reducing suffering. Rather than small numbers of people getting a lot of pleasure, it's about reducing the number of people who are suffering for the wider society. Which was a big problem with act utilitarianism, where you could end up giving one person a whole load of good and it would still seemingly be the same as spreading that good around. And this includes animals as well. Animals are given an elevated status. They're brought up to be equal to humans. They aren't given more rights as such, they're just, you don't want them to suffer. And Singer suggests that if you took a baby, they can't reason any more than a lot of animals can. So why treat animals so badly? Bring them up. Problem is that Peter Singer has got some rather controversial examples. He talks about haemophiliac children. Haemophilia is a condition where blood won't clot and it's passed from mother to son. Only from mother to son. And so, if a child is born male and is haemophiliac, then they haven't got a good life expectancy. However, if a mother was a haemophiliac carrier and they were to get an abortion, there's a 50% chance the child would have been female and not haemophiliac. So the best thing to do, according to Singer, is wait till a child is born, see if they're male, and if they're a male haemophiliac, then kill them. But that brings about some pretty serious moral questions. Is it really right to do that? Hard to say. There are, of course, objections to utilitarianism. Firstly, is this really a moral theory if evil is allowed? If we're allowed to commit evil acts in the process of doing good, surely we could argue that this isn't a moral theory. And in fact, if you think about it, you could commit big evil acts as long as there was more good being created. So on that basis, as long as you were always balancing the good above the evil, you'd be justified. So is it moral to commit really evil acts as long as you get a better result from it? How do we calculate the outcome? That's another really difficult one. Teleological theories like utilitarianism require good information and good judgment. So how do we get all the good information? How do we get all the good judgment? Surely it would be easier to simply follow rules. But, as we've seen from rule utilitarianism, then you run into the problems with deontological theories and instrumentalism. Does good include the past and the future? So when we're thinking about the teleology, is it a good act if we save someone's life and they turn out to be a murderer? No clear answer. What about responsibility to others? Do we not have some responsibility to others? For example, like to our children, responsibility to teach them to do things right, responsibility to teach them how to live and also to keep them safe. And in that case, aren't rules such as never put your finger in a plug socket going to be more useful than always use your judgment, particularly as children don't have good judgment. It hasn't developed yet. If you believe in natural rights, such as the right to life, the right to freedoms, then utilitarianism is not good for you because it suggests that there is no such thing as a natural right. So Bernard Williams came up with a fantastically clever objection to utilitarianism, and that's that in order for utilitarianism to work, not everyone should be utilitarian. Because if everyone was utilitarian, they'd be trying to prevent harm and they'd be doing bad things in order to get the greater good. But if everyone was doing that, there'd be loads of bad things happening. So surely it's better if most of us aren't utilitarian and we have a utilitarian elite, a sort of set of watchmen who will ensure the greater good for everyone. But if that's the case, then we are not exercising our own morality. We're not being free, we're not being moral beings. And so utilitarianism, therefore, is a prison and not something that frees us and our morality. Aristotle as well talked about other virtues, other motivations for things, such as friendship. Friendship in itself is worth achieving, even though it doesn't actually give us any immediate benefit. You know, we look after our friends, even though it might not necessarily be in our best interest at that point, for example, if we're counselling them. And that's a virtue, and surely that's worth motivation in itself. We ought to be virtuous, rather than simply looking out for ourselves. Of course, Aristotle wasn't responding to utilitarianism, but he came up with these ideas which do kind of go against the grain of utilitarianism in general. So there you have it, utilitarianism. We've looked at the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number, how good can be defined, and how act, preference, and rule utilitarianism slightly different to each other in order to try to get the greatest good for the greatest number. However, we've also looked at some of those problems that come from it. So if you've got any questions, then let me know. Otherwise, thanks for watching. See you next time.